Now, our next guest worked in Iraq as a peace-building practitioner, yes, with the United Nations, and has designed a program to de-radicalize ISIS brides. She has now turned her experiences into a novel.
It's lovely to have Dr. Nussaibah Younis with us this morning. Good morning, Nussaibah. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'll get there eventually, Nussaibah.
Practitioner.
It's
a hard one. It's a hard one.
Can you tell us about your work in Iraq and specifically this program to de-radicalize ISIS brides?
Oh, well, that would just be me telling you how terrible I was at my job because it totally failed. I was an Iraq expert and I was working in Iraq on a bunch of peace-building programs. And people from the Iraqi government asked me if I could design a de-radicalization program for women who were perceived to be affiliated to ISIS. And as I sat and tried to needle away at that problem and make it work, it got me thinking about all those young girls from Europe who'd come over to the Middle East to join ISIS and what had become of them. And I realized as I was sort of face to face with some of these women, just how easily I could have ended up in their position. And I hadn't thought about it for a long time, but since I was sort of tasked with this job, it got me thinking about myself as a 15-year-old. And, you know, had I just been a little bit prettier, someone might have made me a jihadi bride.
Wow.
Stop it.
Really? I mean...
No, I know I'm gorgeous now, but at 15, there was quite a lot of facial hair.
A lot going on. Does that have something to do with it? Like, honestly, when we're talking
100%.
about... Does it?
Yeah. Being groomed, you know, is sort of like being hit on. And it helps if you're really attractive. You know, I do feel like I was so fortunate not to have been targeted when I was really vulnerable. Because when I was 15, I had such a bleeding heart, and I think so many people do, where they look at all the injustice in the world and they think, oh my God, how can people allow the world to be like this? And I want to do something to help people. And if at that moment, when you don't really understand yet how the world works and you think you're an adult, but you're not really, if someone comes and tells you, oh, there's a way that you can be a hero and you can help people in the Middle East and there's a way for you to do something, and that happens to be joining a terrorist group, but you don't really understand what that is, it can be very seductive. And I think that's the thing people misunderstand. Sometimes we think that it's just either people who are just monsters and who are bloodthirsty, you know, but actually a lot of people were motivated by empathy and by wanting to be part of like a freedom struggle. And that's what we don't understand. We find it so much easier to understand why a Ukrainian who's living in Europe might want to go back and fight in Ukraine. Why is it so weird to think that a second-generation Muslim living in Europe wouldn't want to go and help Syrians who at the time were being massacred by the Assad government? The real question is, why were they persuaded that that was the right way to go about it? You know, and I think at 15, you can just be so vulnerable to being persuaded that a really terrible thing to do is actually the right thing to do.
So whenever you were designing this program to de-radicalize these brides, what did you realise, what was the reality of these ISIS brides over there?
What I've realised when I was doing this work is that it's not about ideology. You know, we think about, you know, an extreme interpretation of Islam as being the primary problem. But for most of the recruits, they didn't really know anything about the religion. They weren't particularly religious. They certainly weren't well read. You know, they hadn't read the Quran particularly closely. It actually wasn't about religion. It was about them trying to find meaning and purpose and belonging and community. And what was so funny is for some of them, it was just about, you know, going to the Middle East and being a hero and helping people. And I had a moment as an aid worker thinking, God, that's sort of why I'm here as well. You know, you realize that actually lots of aid workers have a similar kind of hero complex and are there trying to save people. And they've just chosen a different route. Yeah. But what shocked me was how similar some of our motivations were.
Nussaibah, I think that's so interesting because honestly, when I was growing up, I did history in college, but for people in Ireland pre the Good Friday Agreement, how it was with freedom fighting, with what was going on in Northern Ireland, it was definitely an ideology that I believed in. I believed that, people were put under the cosh, that we needed to fight for the freedom of Northern Ireland and that there would be sympathies with organisations who were deemed as terrorist, we'll say, by the British government. So, as you mentioned there, it's something that can easily happen. And this radicalisation, it was happening, as you mentioned, in Britain, in mass, by these young 15 and 16-year-old girls. And, we all know the story, Shamima Begum, who picked up herself and her friends and they travelled to Syria. The life when they get there, what's that like for those young girls who we call ISIS brides? Like, these are teenage girls.
Yeah, I mean, their lives in Iraq and Syria were horrendous. Most of them were heavily pressured into getting married very quickly. To men often who were much older than them and who in many cases were violent and abusive. And when those husbands were inevitably killed in battle, they would be pressured to then marry again very quickly. And so these girls who were told that they were going to change the world, that they were going to help suffering children, were just trapped in a series of abusive marriages, one after another, barely leaving the house, having no freedom, and just living just the most appalling hell. And, because of that one idiotic choice they made at 15, then their entire life is over. And as the British government has taken away their opportunity to ever be rehabilitated, to ever live a normal life again.
It's a very serious topic. You've decided to write a book on it, fundamentally. But you've written it as a fiction, but with a comedic twist as well. Why did you feel trying to use humour and comedy is important and a good way to get your message across?
Well, I used to work with young teenage girls from East London. I used to be helping at a homework club. And, when I hung out with girls like that at that age, I just remember how completely hilarious they were. They were so witty and smart and precocious and, like I was as a teenager. And, I think something that gets lost in this sort of dialogue about ISIS brides is the humanity of these girls. Yes, they're dumb and annoying because they're teenagers and they're making stupid choices, but also they're funny and they make jokes and they make fun of you, and their insults are just so devastating. They leave you reeling for a week. And I thought it would just be so fun to have this ISIS bride character just be a full human, be really like what she would be, to be making jokes and be hilarious. But another part of the novel is really a satire of the United Nations. And, I love shows like In the Thick of It or Veep, shows that make fun of how politics works, but in doing so actually really show you what it's like to work inside a political system. And I've never seen that done for the UN. And I thought it would be so fascinating to give a little peek inside what it's like working at a big rarefied international institution that we think is so glamorous, but is actually run by, some horny and incompetent guys.
To everyone, Antonio Gutierrez is putting that below him now. Horny and incompetent.
Sorry, Anthony, I didn't mean you personally necessarily.
Not the Secretary General. We're not saying that's his descriptor. It's so interesting, this story, though, because it's a coming of age. She's a young girl and she's given out to her mum for being at her, and it's just so interesting how you've done it. The reception has been absolutely fantastic. So do you think it's changing perceptions on what people think about such a serious topic?
Yeah, I've had so many DMs. I mean, to be honest, my favorite DMs are I cannot stop laughing and I'm on a train and everyone's looking at me. I love those messages, but I'm also getting messages that are saying, I've just never thought about this
Yeah.
issue deeply. And like I had a prejudice, but I never thought, what if I was just a 15-year-old and I happened to meet a guy like that when I was that age? What would I have really done in that situation? And then how would I have gotten myself out of it? You know, that's the thing. We don't punish other 15-year-olds like this for a mistake they make at that age when they get something wrong and they regret it. We don't punish other 15-year-olds like we're doing to these girls. So yeah, I think it's definitely opened some eyes and also entertained people along the way.
The not horny and incompetent Dr. Nussaibah Younis, thank you so much for talking to us about your debut novel, Fundamentally. It's been a pleasure. Hopefully we get to meet you someday. Thanks, Nussaibah.